When I first pulled into the narrow gravel road that led up to my newly bought log cabin, the crisp air of Pinewood Ridge felt like a relief from the chaos I'd been living through for years, a calm I thought I'd finally earned. The cabin stood proudly at the edge of a pine forest, its wooden walls soaked in golden sunlight and its porch overlooking a quiet lake that mirrored the sky like glass. It was supposed to be a clean slate, a peaceful place I could escape to after selling my business in the city. What I didn't know was that this cabin would soon become the center of a full-blown legal war that would expose corruption, greed, and power abuse within an HOA that technically didn't even have jurisdiction over my land. It all began with a letter taped to my door just 2 weeks after moving in. Bold red letters at the top reading "Notice of Violation," issued by something called the Cedar Woods Homeowners Association. The problem? My property wasn't in Cedar Woods. It was located in a separate county-designated zone that sat just outside their boundary lines by nearly half a mile. Still, the letter accused me of unauthorized construction and environmental disruption for repainting the cabin and repairing the deck railing. At first I laughed, assuming it was a mistake. But when I drove into town the next day, I noticed more signs bearing the HOA's name, Cedar Woods HOA, protecting property values since 1999. Their emblem, a golden leaf on a green crest, seemed to pop up everywhere, on mailboxes, street signs, even on a community truck that patrolled the area. Something about it felt invasive, almost cult-like. I asked around at a local diner, and the waitress leaned close, whispering, "You're on the ridge?" "Oh, honey, you better be careful. Those HOA folks don't take kindly to outsiders, especially ones who don't pay their dues." That made no sense. I wasn't part of their neighborhood, didn't use their amenities, and had no contract tying me to them. Still, the next week I got another notice, this time claiming I owed $5,000 in non-compliance penalties. The letter was signed by Catherine Belmont, HOA president, a name that would soon become my personal nightmare. I decided to call her directly, but the number listed only connected to a voicemail that coldly repeated HOA regulations. So I visited the HOA office myself, a sterile white building surrounded by freshly trimmed hedges, guarded by a man wearing a polo shirt embroidered with that same golden leaf logo. Inside, Catherine greeted me with a practiced smile, tall, blonde, immaculately dressed, and carrying the self-assurance of someone who believed she was above reproach. "Ah, Mr. Turner," she said smoothly, flipping through a binder. "We've been expecting you. You're the owner of Lot 47B, correct?" "That's not a Cedar Woods lot," I corrected her, placing my deed on the counter. "It's county land outside your HOA boundaries. You don't have any authority over my property." Her smile didn't fade. "Well, our community regulations extend to the buffer zone, and your cabin lies within it. You'll need to comply like everyone else." "Buffer zone?" I'd never heard of such a thing in property law. "I'm not paying a dime," I said, gathering my papers. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." I walked out, unaware that I had just declared war on a woman who'd been using her HOA like a personal kingdom for years. Within days, the harassment began. Unmarked cars idling near my driveway, HOA inspectors taking pictures of my property, and mysterious damage to my mailbox. I reported it to the county sheriff, but they shrugged it off, saying HOA disputes were civil matters. Then, one morning, I opened my mail to find an official notice from a county clerk. Apparently, the HOA had filed a lien against my cabin for non-payment of dues, totaling over $35,000. My jaw dropped. They had forged documents to make it look like my property was part of Cedar Woods. That's when I knew something far darker was at play. I spent nights poring over county maps and property records, and the truth slowly surfaced. Catherine and her board had been quietly annexing land that didn't belong to them for over a decade. They'd redrawn HOA boundary maps and used them to fine, threaten, and even seize land from unknowing property owners who lived nearby. I found at least 6 other names who'd been bullied into paying bogus fees or selling their property under pressure. Most didn't fight back, they just wanted peace. But I wasn't built that way. I filed a counterclaim and hired an investigative attorney named Laura Pierce, known locally for exposing HOA corruption. Together, we started digging into the HOA's financials and found something explosive. Catherine had been funneling HOA funds into a shell construction company owned by her husband, who managed maintenance contracts that never existed. Every cent of those fake fines, those community fees, had been padding their personal accounts. When word of our investigation spread, my phone started ringing off the hook. Angry homeowners who'd also been targeted by Cedar Woods, some even claiming they were threatened with eviction. Catherine responded by doubling down, sending me a certified letter demanding I appear before the HOA disciplinary board or face foreclosure. The arrogance was unbelievable. I decided to record my next interaction with them. At the so-called hearing, held in their clubhouse, Catherine stood at the head of a long mahogany table flanked by 5 board members, all of whom seemed terrified of crossing her. I played dumb, letting her outline her fabricated claims before dropping the bombshell. I pulled out a large county map with official stamps and signatures proving my property wasn't, and had never been within Cedar Woods' jurisdiction. Then I handed copies of financial records showing her personal bank transactions matching HOA withdrawals. The room went silent. "You're done extorting people," I said, staring straight at her. "This ends now." Her composure cracked for the first time. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she hissed, but the board members looked shaken. The next morning, I awoke to find my tires slashed and my security cameras ripped off the wall. But the footage from my backup system caught the culprits, 2 of the HOA's so-called security officers. I sent the evidence to Laura, who passed it to the county DA. Within a week, the HOA's lawyer reached out for settlement discussions. They wanted to quietly drop the lien and pay me off to withdraw my complaint. I refused. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about exposing a racket that had been running unchecked for years. Laura filed a civil lawsuit accusing the HOA of fraud, harassment, and extortion. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly, Cedar Woods HOA was under public scrutiny. Reporters started camping outside Catherine's office, demanding statements. The HOA members who'd once worshipped her began resigning one by one. Still, she didn't back down. She issued a public statement claiming I was a disgruntled squatter and that my documents were falsified. That was her biggest mistake. Because the county clerk herself released an official letter verifying my property's independence from Cedar Woods and confirming the HOA's fraudulent boundary expansion. When that went public, the entire community turned against Catherine. Homeowners stormed the next board meeting, shouting for her resignation. Yet even as the walls closed in, she tried to salvage her control by accusing me of defamation. But I had proof, witnesses, and a growing army of angry residents ready to testify. And just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, I received a call that changed everything. The county prosecutor had opened a criminal investigation into the HOA's leadership. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement. Serious charges that could put Catherine and her husband behind bars. That night, I sat on my porch, watching the reflection of the stars ripple across the lake, realizing how close I'd come to losing everything. This cabin, once my peaceful escape, had turned into the battleground for something much larger, a fight against corruption hiding in plain sight. But the war wasn't over yet. Because as the case gained traction, I started noticing unfamiliar faces watching me again from the tree line. Unmarked trucks parked down the road, and an anonymous note slipped under my door that read, "You should have taken the deal." I crumpled it in my hand and whispered into the dark, "You picked the wrong man to threaten." The silence of Pinewood Ridge seemed to echo my words, carrying them through the forest like a promise, one that would soon shake Cedar Woods to its very core. The morning after that warning note appeared on my porch, I knew this wasn't just a neighborhood feud anymore. It was a full-blown campaign of intimidation. I'd seen it before in the city, when corrupt landlords or shady business partners tried to scare whistleblowers into silence. But this time, it wasn't corporate suits I was dealing with. It was a group of suburban tyrants hiding behind community titles. My cabin had become both fortress and target. I reinforced my security system, installed motion-triggered floodlights, and kept a firearm within reach, though I prayed I'd never need it. Laura, my attorney, urged me to stay calm and trust the legal process, but even she admitted things were getting strange. 2 days after we filed the fraud case, her office received a visit from a man claiming to be a compliance officer from the Cedar Woods HOA. He wasn't. He was an off-duty sheriff's deputy, bribed by Catherine's husband to persuade her to drop the lawsuit. The deputy's badge number showed up in Laura's footage, and she forwarded it straight to Internal Affairs. That's when everything started unraveling for the Belmonts. The county DA launched a full-scale investigation into Cedar Woods, issuing subpoenas for their bank records and board meeting minutes. Local TV stations started calling it the Pinewood property scandal, and the news spread fast. Reporters camped outside the HOA office, trying to interview residents who'd been bullied, fined, or threatened. Every day, new victims came forward with their stories. People who'd lost homes, been forced to pay thousands, or had liens placed illegally on their deeds. The Belmonts' empire of fear was collapsing, but they weren't going down quietly. Catherine still strutted around like she owned the mountain, issuing press statements accusing me and Laura of organizing a smear campaign. Her lawyer, a slick operator named Dennis Cole, filed countersuits claiming we were committing fraud by fabricating evidence. The irony was laughable, but it was also dangerous. Catherine had connections. People in the county clerk's office, law enforcement, and even local government. That's how she'd gotten away with it for so long. But this time the net was tightening. When forensic accountants reviewed the HOA's transactions, they found over $2.8 million in maintenance expenses transferred to shell companies tied to Catherine's husband and her brother-in-law. Meanwhile, her supposed legal buffer zone around Cedar Woods was nothing but a forged amendment, filed in 2016 using a fake signature from a former county commissioner who died 3 years earlier. It was a house of cards, and I had just kicked out the foundation. Yet, the deeper the investigation went, the more dangerous things became. One night, around 1 a.m., I woke to the faint hum of an engine outside. Through my window, I spotted a dark SUV parked by the tree line. Its headlights were off, but I could see 2 figures inside. When I stepped out with my flashlight, they sped away, tires spitting gravel. The next morning, Laura called to tell me her office had been broken into, files scattered, but nothing stolen except one folder, the Cedar Woods bank statements. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. I offered to cover security for her office, but she refused, saying, "They're desperate, Tyler. That means we're winning." She was right. Within a week, the DA's office froze all HOA accounts pending investigation. Without funds, the HOA couldn't pay its security contractors, landscapers, or even legal team. Residents began revolting, demanding resignations, holding impromptu meetings in driveways, even calling for a vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. Catherine tried to calm them with promises that the truth would come out soon, but no one was buying it. A video leaked online of her screaming at board members during a private meeting, calling them traitors and idiots. The clip went viral locally, and within hours, half her board resigned. The following day, Catherine appeared at my cabin. Yes, in person. She pulled up in a white Mercedes, heels clicking on the gravel as she approached my porch, sunglasses shielding her fury. I opened the door, recording on my phone. "Mr. Turner," she began, her voice tight, "I suggest you withdraw your complaints immediately. You don't know the legal fire you're playing with." "Actually," I said calmly, "it's you who's playing with fire. And this time, the county's finally watching." Her jaw clenched. "You think you're the hero? You've ruined an entire community. Those people depended on me." "No," I shot back. "They feared you. Big difference." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're going to regret this." Then she turned and walked off, leaving the faint smell of perfume and desperation in her wake. That night, my cabin's front porch caught fire. Luckily, the flames didn't spread far. I had extinguishers ready, but it was clear someone had poured accelerant near the railing. The fire marshal confirmed it was arson. I gave him the SUV footage from earlier nights, and he handed it to the investigators. 2 days later, they identified one of the men, a private contractor previously employed by the HOA's security division. The arson attempt became the final nail in the Belmont's coffin. The DA's office expanded the charges, adding attempted intimidation and property damage to the list. Local news outlets swarmed the courthouse when Catherine and her husband were subpoenaed to testify. As they arrived, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing, while Catherine kept her head high but her eyes hollow. Inside the courtroom, Laura presented our evidence with surgical precision: fake boundary maps, embezzled funds, illegal fines, and testimonies from homeowners. I sat behind her, every nerve on edge, while the Belmont's lawyer tried to twist every fact into fiction. But he couldn't fight the mountain of proof we'd gathered. The judge's expression grew darker with each exhibit Laura introduced. Then came the bombshell, a whistleblower from within the HOA, none other than the former treasurer, who admitted under oath that Catherine ordered him to alter boundary lines and destroy original maps. The courtroom gasped. Catherine turned pale. The treasurer's testimony was the final blow. When the hearing adjourned, the DA announced that the case would proceed to criminal court. Fraud, forgery, racketeering, and conspiracy charges, each carrying serious prison time. Outside, homeowners cheered as the Belmonts left, surrounded by reporters. But even then, I didn't celebrate. I'd learned that corruption doesn't die quietly. It claws and bites until its last breath. And I was right. A week before the trial, Catherine vanished. Her Mercedes was found abandoned near a rest stop 2 counties over, her phone smashed in the dirt. Rumors spread. Some said she fled to Canada. Others whispered that she'd made a deal to testify against bigger names. Because as investigators kept digging, they discovered her HOA network wasn't limited to Cedar Woods. She'd been part of a larger scheme involving 3 other HOAs in the region, all linked by shared contractors and fake development funds. It wasn't just a neighborhood scandal anymore. It was a multi-million-dollar racket operating under the guise of community management. Federal agents stepped in, and suddenly my little cabin conflict had become the key to a statewide investigation. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt watched again. Unmarked vehicles still drove by my property at odd hours, and strange emails began hitting my inbox. Threats, veiled warnings, even photos of my cabin from unknown sources. The authorities offered to relocate me temporarily, but I refused. I wasn't running. I'd fought too hard to reclaim my peace, and I wasn't about to abandon it now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ridge, I stood on my porch and saw a figure watching from the woods. Tall, still, almost blending into the shadows. I raised my flashlight, but they turned and disappeared among the pines. I knew the Belmonts were finished legally, but the people who'd helped them weren't. This wasn't just about an HOA anymore. It was about power, how it infects small places, how it hides behind bureaucracy, and how it destroys anyone who stands against it. But I wasn't destroyed. I was just getting started, because if Catherine thought she could scare me off, she'd underestimated how far I was willing to go. And as I closed the door that night, locking it behind me, I couldn't shake one thought. The real war wasn't over. It was only shifting to a higher battlefield, one that reached far beyond Cedar Woods and into the very heart of the system that had protected people like her for years. The first day of the federal trial began under a sky the color of steel, a thin mist clinging to the courthouse steps, as if the weather itself sensed the tension simmering beneath the surface. Reporters crowded the entrance, cameras flashing like lightning as armored SUVs rolled up, escorting the remaining Cedar Woods board members who'd been indicted alongside Catherine and her husband. Though Catherine herself had disappeared weeks before, her absence only added to the storm. Her husband, Richard Belmont, now sat at the center of it, accused of orchestrating the money laundering operations that had funneled millions through their network of fraudulent HOAs. I stood quietly by the courthouse entrance beside Laura, my attorney, the weight of the last year pressing down on me. I had lost sleep, peace, and any illusion that small-town life was simple. But as the flags flapped above the courthouse and the crowd of former residents cheered our arrival, I realized something bigger than my personal battle was happening here. This was no longer about one cabin, one man's property, or even one corrupt HOA. It was about every person who'd been bullied, silenced, and extorted under the guise of community regulation. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Prosecutors from the state and federal levels sat ready, boxes of evidence piled beside them, maps, bank ledgers, signed statements, video recordings, and emails that exposed the rot beneath the polished veneer of cedar woods. When the judge entered, the room fell into silence. The clerk read the charges aloud: conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, embezzlement, mail fraud, and racketeering. Each word felt like justice echoing through the hall. Richard Belmont sat across from me, thinner than I remembered, his once perfect posture slouched under the weight of reality. His eyes darted toward me only once, full of contempt, as if I were the one who'd ruined his empire. In a way, I had. The prosecution began by establishing the pattern of manipulation, how Cedar Woods had used falsified maps to illegally annex nearby properties, how the HOA fines were fabricated, and how Richard's company, Pine Shield Contractors, had received millions for maintenance projects that never existed. Laura and I watched as one witness after another took the stand. Homeowners who'd been coerced into paying fake dues, a former accountant who confessed to shredding documents on Richard's orders, and even a retired county clerk who testified that he'd been pressured by community leaders to sign off on boundary extensions. The walls of the courtroom became a gallery of their deceit, every exhibit another crack in the facade. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, an appearance from none other than Catherine herself. She hadn't fled the country, as rumors suggested. She'd been hiding in a lakeside cabin 2 states over, discovered by federal marshals after tracing a burner phone. When she entered the courtroom, escorted by agents, the tension was electric. Gone was the pristine, commanding woman I'd faced months earlier. Her hair was disheveled, her wrists cuffed, and her eyes hollow with sleeplessness. The prosecution had struck a deal. She'd testify against her husband and other conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence. The betrayal hit Richard like a thunderclap. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched as Catherine took the stand. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, the years of manipulation and deceit poured out like a confession from a soul long buried under guilt. She admitted to forging the HOA maps, ordering illegal liens, bribing officials, and using threats to silence anyone who questioned her authority. But her most shocking admission came when she revealed that Cedar Woods wasn't unique. It was one of 12 HOAs across the state participating in the same racket, connected through a shadow network of management consultants who specialized in exploiting legal loopholes in HOA law. That revelation sent ripples through the courtroom. The federal prosecutors exchanged glances, realizing the case was much bigger than anticipated. My small cabin dispute had just blown open a statewide conspiracy worth tens of millions. The news spread fast. By evening, it was on every major channel. HOA corruption ring exposed, millions defrauded from homeowners. For the first time, I saw the faces of the victims across the state. People just like me who'd been terrorized by overreaching associations that thought they could rewrite the law. Yet even as justice loomed, the Belmont's downfall felt strangely hollow. During her testimony, Catherine tried to twist her motives into something noble, claiming she'd only wanted to maintain order and protect community standards. But the evidence told a darker truth. She'd built a kingdom of fear and profit, a modern-day fiefdom where ordinary people paid tribute under threat of fines, liens, or humiliation. When the defense finally rested, their argument sounded weak and desperate. Richard's lawyer claimed ignorance, saying his client didn't know how the funds were being used, while Catherine's counsel painted her as a victim of systemic pressure. The jury saw through it. After 2 weeks of deliberation, the verdict came in, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Richard sat motionless as the judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. Catherine, due to her cooperation, received 6 years, but was also ordered to pay restitution to every homeowner affected by her schemes. When the gavel struck, it echoed like thunder, a sound I'd been waiting to hear since the first day that fake fine appeared on my cabin door. I should have felt triumph, but instead, a heavy silence filled me. Justice, even when served, never erased the scars it left behind. I stepped outside into the bright afternoon light, surrounded by reporters, microphones thrust toward me. "Mr. Turner, do you feel vindicated?" one asked. I looked at the sea of faces and thought about every sleepless night, every threat, every burned railing and shredded mailbox. "Vindicated?" I repeated softly. "Maybe, but this isn't about me. It's about making sure no one else goes through what we did." The crowd clapped, and for a brief moment, I felt peace. But as I drove back to my cabin that evening, that peace wavered. My property had become a symbol now, a rallying point for others. People began showing up uninvited, victims from other towns, journalists, even activists fighting HOA reform. They wanted advice, stories, guidance. Some wanted revenge. I did my best to help them, to share what I'd learned about fighting back legally. But I also knew there were still people out there who'd lost everything, and not all of them were content with waiting for courts to deliver justice. A few weeks later, Laura called to tell me something disturbing. 2 of the remaining board members from Cedar Woods had been found dead in what authorities were calling a murder-suicide. The official story was vague, but whispers around town said someone had silenced them before they could testify in a related case. The darkness that Catherine unleashed wasn't done spreading, it was eating its own. And though the Belmonts were behind bars, I had the feeling this network of power and greed went higher than anyone had dared to admit. The FBI was still investigating the other HOAs, and some agents had started contacting me for details about my encounters with Catherine's business partners. I cooperated, handing over every document, recording, and photo I had. Yet part of me wondered if digging deeper might expose me to something even worse. Corruption this embedded didn't vanish, it adapted. A few months after the trial, I received a thick envelope with no return address. Inside was a deed, a transfer of ownership for a small piece of land located far beyond Cedar Woods, signed anonymously. No explanation, just a note that read, "For your courage. Keep it safe. You'll understand soon." I stared at it, heart pounding. The land's coordinates pointed to an undeveloped area of Pine County that, according to public records, had once been slated for a massive residential project managed by one of the Belmont-affiliated companies. It made no sense. I took the deed to Laura, who had it verified. It was legitimate. But why would anyone give me land connected to the same network I helped destroy? That night I drove out to see it. The area was remote, blanketed by dense trees and silence. There was nothing there. No roads, no structures, just the ghost of a foundation half buried in weeds. Yet as I walked the property, I noticed something strange. Cement markers with numbers carved into them, arranged in a grid pattern. It looked like the early layout of a development that had been abandoned halfway through. I took photos and sent them to Laura, who forwarded them to the federal investigators. 2 days later, she called back, her voice tight. "Tyler," she said, "those markers match the layout of a project tied to another HOA currently under investigation. Whoever sent you that deed wanted you to find it." The realization chilled me. Someone within the system, perhaps another whistleblower, was feeding me breadcrumbs, leading me towards something even bigger. Maybe the rot didn't stop with Cedar Woods. Maybe it went statewide or even national. Standing in that overgrown clearing, wind whispering through the pines, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. The battle that started with my cabin wasn't over. It had just evolved. And somewhere out there, others like Catherine were still pulling the strings, hiding behind new company names, new faces, and new communities. But they'd made one mistake. They'd awakened someone who wasn't afraid to fight back. And this time, I wasn't alone. The story of Cedar Woods had lit a fire across the state. Homeowners were forming alliances, demanding transparency, calling for reform. My cabin, once the symbol of isolation, had become the headquarters for resistance. And as I looked out over the ridge that evening, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, I made myself a silent promise. Whatever came next, I'd be ready. Because no matter how deep the corruption ran, no matter how far they reached, there would always be someone like me standing in their way. One cabin, one homeowner, one voice strong enough to shake an empire. Months passed after the trial, and the world around Pinewood Ridge began to settle. But something in me had changed forever. What started as one man's defense of his small cabin had turned into a statewide reckoning that swept through boardrooms, county offices, and courtrooms like a wildfire. The Belmont name had become a warning, whispered across real estate meetings and HOA conferences, as the perfect example of what greed could do when left unchecked. I thought that meant peace had finally returned, but instead it meant my name wouldn't stay out of the headlines. Journalists called me the cabin plaintiff. Activists asked me to speak at homeowner rights events, and county officials suddenly acted friendlier than ever. I'd gone from target to symbol, yet all I really wanted was quiet. The sound of the lake brushing against the shore, the creak of my porch swing, and maybe the chance to sleep a full night without my phone buzzing with new tips or threats. Then one morning, a thick envelope arrived from Washington bearing a federal seal. It was a letter from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, thanking me for substantial assistance in uncovering multi-state HOA fraud and inviting me to testify before Congress about homeowner abuse. I almost laughed. A year ago, I was repainting a deck and getting fined for it. Now the government wanted my advice on policy. Laura urged me to accept. "You've earned this, Tyler. It's your chance to make the fight mean something." So I went. Standing under the bright lights of a congressional hearing felt surreal. The microphones lined up like eyes waiting for truth. I told them everything. How a fake fine turned into a $35,000 lien. How a woman named Catherine Belmont manipulated maps to steal land. How neighbors were terrorized under the pretense of protecting property values. I showed them photos of burned mailboxes, altered documents, terrified homeowners. When I finished, the room was silent. One senator leaned forward and said, "Mr. Turner, you didn't just expose corruption. You reminded us that oversight begins with courage." Those words stayed with me. Within months, federal regulators drafted new legislation tightening restrictions on HOA powers, mandating transparency in financial reporting, and limiting fines without court approval. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and it had grown from that one crooked letter taped to my door. Back home, the lake reflected the glow of a new dawn. The abandoned HOA office was now empty, its sign removed, its walls covered with vines. Nature was reclaiming what arrogance once built. I turned my cabin into something different, a quiet retreat where exhausted people could come for advice, paperwork, or simply to breathe without fear of another demand notice appearing overnight. Some called it the Freedom Cabin. People brought stories from across the country, and each story reminded me how fragile ownership could be when power went unchecked. Sometimes, late at night, I'd stand outside and listen to the wind moving through the pines and imagine all those unseen victims finally exhaling, free at last. The Belmonts would remain in prison for years, but the real victory wasn't their punishment. It was that the system they exploited was finally being watched. One evening, while I was stacking firewood, Laura visited with a small box in her hands. Inside was a framed certificate, State Citizen Award for Civic Courage. She smiled and said, "For someone who just wanted to be left alone, you sure changed a lot of laws." I laughed, a quiet, tired laugh, and told her maybe peace was finally possible. She looked toward the forest and said softly, "It is because you didn't give up." When she drove away, the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the sky gold and crimson. I sat on the porch, feeling the cool wind against my face, hearing the frogs begin their nightly chorus. The fight, the fear, the lawsuits, all of it seemed distant now, like a nightmare fading with daylight. Yet deep down I knew the story would outlive me. Every time a homeowner challenged an unfair fine, every time an HOA accountant thought twice before falsifying a report, my battle echoed quietly in the background. I finally understood that justice isn't loud. It's steady, patient, and built by those who refuse to be silent. As darkness settled over the ridge, I poured a glass of bourbon, raised it toward the stars, and whispered, "Here's to peace hard won." The lake shimmered in reply, still and endless, like a mirror to the future, one where no one would ever again be bullied for daring to own their piece of the earth. And for the first time since that cursed letter appeared on my door, I felt completely, finally free.